I am so honored to be here this afternoon sharing with you this talk that is entitled Gaps to Care and Counseling in the Asian American Church, Envisioning a Multi-Level System of Care and Counseling. So I am coming to you to share my vision or hopes for the Asian American Church to be more fully equipped regarding the care and counseling ministry as a biblical counselor, a psychologist, and pastoral ministry staff at my local Korean American church in Philadelphia. Through my ministry and work, I've experienced a lot of challenges practically on the ground. And those three kinds of parts of who I've been trained to be as a staff at the church, as a biblical counselor, and as a psychologist, I have seen a lot of working in those intersections. There were issues that I thought would be so important to share with the Asian American Church. And so with that in mind, I have come here to really share my heart with you and my hope about how I can envision the importance of counseling in the Asian American Church. So my angle is going to be a little different from what Pastor Kim Kira had shared in terms of the importance of biblical counseling in the local church. And I imagine that we are talking about also the same importance of counseling in the local church. I often find that counseling in the local Asian American church is often put on the side or considered an adjunct or something that is to be developed later on. But what I'm sharing with you today is to really emphasize, again, the importance of really thinking about implementing a counseling ministry that does really care about the suffering and the hardship that Asian Americans go through. So historically, there have been some folks in the church who might have thought that if parishioners are taught more about scripture, or there's a really robust preaching ministry or the ministry of the word to parishioners, then parishioners should not need counseling. That may be true on the one hand, but on the other hand, it is now more and more a common understanding that many church members struggle deeply since we live in a fallen world awaiting Jesus' return. It is not uncommon for parishioners to struggle with acute depression, debilitating anxiety, deep trauma, sexual trauma, racial trauma, abuse, divorce, parenting issues, addictions, and so on. And I have come alongside many of these folks. So it's not a reach to say then that care and counseling ministry in the church really matters. And I wanted to share with you some more reasons why care and counseling in the Asian American church really matters. First of all, pastors are very overloaded and overwhelmed. This year, I think you've heard this statistic throughout. 38% of pastors have thought about quitting full-time ministry, according to the Barna Group in 2021. Interestingly, also, a Lifeway research study identified 12 key drivers that enabled pastors to continue to serve. And one of them was getting help with counseling church members. So that's really an important reason why care and counseling in the church matters. Here's a second reason why care and counseling in the Asian American church matters. There has been an increase in Asian American and Pacific Islander hate and racism. According to FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting in 2020, there was a 73% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes. Also in LA County last year, anti-Asian hate crimes increased by 76%. As you can see, that number really reflects the national trend. A total of 10,905 hate incidents against API persons were reported to Stop API Hate in the last year. 64% of Asian teens reported experiencing racism, according to a CDC survey done in 2022. And we really can't forget the mass shooting in Atlanta or the attacks and killing of API people in New York City and elsewhere. I know that as an Asian woman, when I think about the killings of a lot of them were also Asian women or elderly Asian women, that really does strike me. And it really causes me to consider myself in the context of, as a Christian living in this body, as an embodied soul, how important it is to recognize that this body is the temple of the living Lord. So, according to all of these statistics, as you can see, the Asian American church can uniquely acknowledge and understand the impact and suffering of this kind of trauma on Asian American church members. When Pastor Owen was sharing his message on the first night, I really felt encouraged by the way that after the Atlanta shooting, after all of the crimes happened, how his church really came together and prayed together and addressed those issues. That's so important. There, again, is an example of how within the Asian American context and the church, we have a unique place to be able to address and really understand this kind of trauma on Asian American church members. Another reason that care and counseling in the church matters is that there is an increased awareness of the impact of intergenerational transmission of trauma for Asian Americans. I'm seeing a lot of Asian American adults who are coming in with depression, anxiety, and even PTSD due to their relationship with their parents, who themselves had experienced harsh, abusive, neglectful parenting. And when I share this, I'm not saying this because necessarily it's a result of some kind of cultural approach to parenting. I don't want to proliferate this stereotype that Asian parents are just harsh and mean, because that's not necessarily true. But perhaps Asian parents may have themselves also experienced harsh or traumatic conditions in which they faced. And when I share that, I'm not saying that then therefore when they are abusing their children that is an excuse. I'm just merely talking about the importance of how complicated these kinds of struggles may be, especially as there is an increased awareness for many Asian Americans about the impact of intergenerational trauma, transmission of trauma. Another reason why care and counseling in the church matters is that more Asian Americans are seeking counseling. And we can't forget that we are facing and still living in this collective trauma, the pandemic. I am walking alongside several folks whose parent or family member had died of COVID. And not only is this collective trauma results in this kind of death, but what I've also seen is that there's another layer that Asian Americans have experienced in this pandemic is, again, the racial kind of trauma that is layered on it. A final reason why care and counseling in the church matters is the high rate of depression and suicidality. According to a CDC survey in 2022, 44% of teens reported feeling sad or hopeless. 20% of teens seriously considered attempting suicide. While this statistic might be focusing on teens, this also becomes a parenting and a family issue. So as I shared with you some of these statistics and reasons why care and counseling in the church and in the Asian American church matters, I wanted to move on to sharing with you a little bit more about gaps then in the church that as an Asian American church we could think about and consider filling. Galatians 6:2 says, "Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." This is Jesus' supreme invitation to the church, for he is the ultimate burden bearer. As the Asian American church grows to recognize the counseling needs of their parishioners, and as the church tries to bear these burdens, I have seen many gaps in care and counseling ministry. And here are a few notable gaps in the church I experienced, both working in the church and also partnering with the church. And again, as I share with you about these gaps, these are gaps that I experienced, especially in the intersection of my work as a psychologist, as a biblical counselor, and as a person working in the church. First, what I have seen is that urgent counseling needs are many times not prioritized. And what I understand is that it's not so much as a lack of desire or care by the church and church leaders, but maybe due to lack of know-how and or lack of procedure or protocol. I wanted to give you an example. For example, there was a woman who was referred to me by a church who was facing really critical marital issues. When I began meeting with this woman, she expressed that she sought help from the church over several years and became frustrated and hurt until it became really too unbearable. What was going on in her marriage was that her husband was struggling with a really serious addiction. And as a result, he would leave the family weeks at a time or months at a time. And then he would deplete the family's financial resources to fuel his addiction. And then when his wife had put a stop or prevented access to the finances, he would even threaten his own life. So she endured all of this while caring for their very young children and going to her full-time job. So again, although the church leaders were very compassionate, when this family finally got referred, they did not know what to do or how to help. Her urgent issues were not prioritized. Here's another gap. And I call this the one-off counseling approach, which is also linked to a lack of follow-up and the continuous care in the church. What I mean by this is that while pastors or church leaders will provide referrals for church members' counseling issues, which is really, really good, then there is either no follow-up, lack of follow-up, or no continuous care support for church members' ongoing care needs after counseling is completed. So for example, I worked with a couple referred to me by a church who were having a crisis in their marriage. This crisis was very complicated. It had many layers, a lot of issues that had to be addressed in counseling, and it would involve a longer kind of term work. However, the church provided funding for a limited number of counseling sessions, and although this was good, working with a couple, we acknowledged together with a limited number of counseling sessions, we had to set prioritized goals. Once the couple finished biblical counseling, there was either no follow-up, from the church. I've also encountered other cases like this, where there was a follow-up, but also lack of plans in the church that would provide the couple with needed continuous support amidst their growth. I wanted to just mention one more point about one-off counseling. So here's the question. Referrals are good, and it's really helpful. That's a part of your church counseling ministry that is very important. But then after those referrals, and after you take care of that one couple's situation, well, what about other couples, church members, or issues that might arise in the future? So again, this referral might have addressed one issue or one couple. This was a one-off kind of counseling. So then what? As I thought about this kind of gap in the church, I imagined this question: could this be a systemic issue that needs to be addressed in the church for them and others? I often think that although referring church members is helpful, but it might not be enough. I wanted to mention one more final notable gap in the church. And that gap is that church pastors and leaders are sometimes or oftentimes the last to know about really critical issues that their parishioners have gone through. In one church, church leaders found out only after a church member died by suicide that this member was struggling with deep, deep depression. So as I slow down and ask you to think about how important it is to think about counseling in the local church and developing a counseling ministry, not one that is just a kind of an adjunct or an afterthought. And as I share with you not only reasons why counseling in the church matters, but also how, in my experience, there have been many gaps as churches have been trying to really implement counseling in their local church, I wanted to ask all of us to think about this question. So how can the church respond to the increasing counseling needs of parishioners and address these gaps? Now, what I'm going to present to you next in this vision of a multi-level organized system of care and counseling in the church that involves many levels of leadership and church members is that this vision that I will be sharing with you will be focusing specifically on the counseling needs of care and counseling ministry. So I'm not talking about like the overall care ministry, but I'm talking about the counseling, specifically the counseling needs in the counseling and care, in the needs of care and counseling ministry. So while I hope to expand your imagination on the practicing of bearing one another's burdens, you might not be able to apply this fully or systemically, but you may want to consider which areas you would like to develop more given your understanding of the counseling needs in your church members and the resources that are available to you. So this vision is amenable to contextualizing to your church needs and where you think you might need to develop in your counseling ministry. So think of it kind of like a good menu, taste, assess, evaluate where and what you might want to implement to fill in the gaps regarding the counseling ministry in your church. So as a way to introduce this vision to you, imagine this systemic way of organizing your counseling ministry like a traffic signal. Green is go, yellow is slow down, and red is stop. So in the first level, or level 1, I call it the proactive care and counseling level. At this level, the counseling ministry is focused on providing proactive counseling support to all church members. And that's something what Kim Kira was talking about, how important it is to really implement counseling support to all church members. At this level, the church can address common counseling struggles in a biblical way. Examples of common struggles may be anxiety or stress, depression that's not acute, grief, loss, marriage, parenting issues, conflict resolution, how to deal with racial issues that people of God encounter, so on and so forth. And I'm not saying that at this level that you can't really address the more complicated or deeper issues, but I'm asking you to really think about how equipped or how you are able to, how experienced or how you may have a level of understanding, to think about your level of understanding of how you could minister at this level. So at this level, here's what I imagine the church can do. The church can address these common issues for all church members through these methods. So one method is small group studies. For example, you can have small group studies addressing fear and anxiety using a workbook like When I'm Afraid by Ed Welch. You can also, another method of really reaching the whole church and providing this kind of counseling support is through seminars. For example, you might have a seminar for church members on dealing with racism in a biblical way. One church in New York City invited me to speak on raising awareness to parents about the impact of racism on their children and to help parents support their children through a biblical worldview. You can have seminars on marriage or how to raise children. You can have many different kinds of seminars at this level. A third kind of method that you can use at this level of proactive care and counseling might be church-wide trainings. For example, you might have a church-wide training on how to care for one another or how to build meaningful relationships in the church. You might also have church-wide trainings on how to do conflict resolution. There's a really good book by Ken Sande called The Peacemaker. And this is not much different from what Kim Kira was talking about with regard to really the importance of building a foundation for the church to be ministered to through the gospel of change, and how important it is to understand how these kinds of methods of really reaching the whole church can help the church to imagine a culture of counseling for one another, to one another. And another method, a final method that you can all think about is you might do a sermon series. A sermon series maybe that is biblical counseling oriented, maybe talking about idolatries of the heart or common fears or common stressors. So you can see how this level, again, is called proactive care and counseling because these avenues open up opportunities for your parishioners to start to share, to be authentic, to be able to start to speak truths to one another, to start to become more vulnerable and really be able to firmly be founded in the gospel ministry of heart change. And as I share with you about that level, what's also important about that level is that as you as a church start to build that foundation and in that type of counseling ministry, it's called proactive because it may prevent more urgent issues. It may really start to build up an understanding of, again, how heart change is imagined or understood or lived out practically. But at this level, what I have often experienced is that not everyone might be reached, and not everyone's issues or struggles may be addressed at this level. And that's not to say that there's a lack of power in gospel change. That's to also share about how that process of sanctification is lifelong. And not only that, it's a journey that will have many ups and downs. I've also experienced a lot of folks who came into counseling where while they had professed their deep love for Jesus and they expressed how important it is in regard to their understanding of the ministry of the word, they've also shared how sometimes because of the struggles that they have encountered, how just hearing the word of God often would even bring up fear or trembling or experiences that were really difficult to really dig into. And so again, I'm not saying that the gospel ministry is lacking power, but what's important is that because of the journey that folks are on, and there is such variation and there is a development or a process in which sanctification happens, this level, again, might not address everybody's issues. And so this leads me to level 2. Level 2 is called purposeful care and counseling. So I envision that in this level, the church and church leaders are addressing a few more complex and intense counseling needs that are brought to their awareness. Now, if you imagine that at level 1, as you open up one anothering ministries, as you provide small groups, as you really think about building that culture change of counseling in the local church, and as you think about that, there will be many opportunities where you will encounter a lot of parishioners or folks who will be opening up about deeper struggles and issues that are very acute. And so that level is important to also provide a pathway for being able to help the church and the church leaders understand and identify that there might be a more concentrated need that's required for certain parishioners, certain church members. So again, in level 2, the church, I imagine, and church leaders are addressing more complex and intense counseling needs brought to their awareness that require, again, more attention, more involvement, and appropriate coordinated care among parishioners, trained, experienced lay counselors in the church, church leaders, and pastors. So this level is called purposeful care and counseling. In this level, a purposeful response is necessary. So more intense and complex counseling needs in this level, for example, might involve depression or anxiety that is really debilitating. Couples who are unable to resolve conflicts, resulting in a vicious cycle of hurt. Someone who might have thoughts about suicide that may be starting to develop into further than ideation, perhaps even talking about few intentions. In this level, another example is someone who might be starting to develop an eating disorder. So what I envision at this level of the care and counseling ministry is that there might be a team of people in your church. And that team, I imagine, ought to be diverse, not just the leaders or the pastors, but that a team of people might involve parishioners who are gifted differently, who might provide a different vantage point, women, other folks who really can provide some support and be able to coordinate together. So at this level, in the midst of that team that comes together, an assessment might first need to be done in order to identify whether the parishioners' counseling issues are beyond the scope of what you, in your own pastoral counseling ministry or your lay leaders have to offer. And I say that because that I recognize that a lot of churches here may not even have lay counselors or may just have a pastor. I also recognize that some churches might not even have, so churches might not have all of those resources available. And so at this level, even as the team comes together, it is really assessing what needs may be important to highlight or identify whether the parishioners' counseling issues, again, are beyond the scope of what you in your pastoral counseling or your lay leaders, lay counselors have to offer. In this level, I also imagine that after assessing, if your church does not have a counseling center, or you might not have experienced lay counselors, or again, if this is beyond your pastoral counseling skills, you might have a referral list of folks to refer your parishioner out to. So you have to think about developing, obviously, a good referral list for various counseling needs. Let's say, for example, addressing eating disorders. Will you have someone on your list who is able to really address those issues? Thirdly, at this level, at level 2, you might be developing a team of people, again, that is coordinated maybe by a church leader or pastor who might start to then build an appropriate care plan, a counseling plan for folks who have been referred out for more acute counseling issues. The team of people may be putting together, and again, as I say that to you, you're thinking about a diverse kind of group of people, not just people who think similarly. So this team of people may be putting together a plan for how church programs that are in existence or ministries and a person or persons can come alongside those folks while they are in counseling or have completed counseling. So my point here is that the church members, the church member or the counselee is not out of sight, out of mind, but the church is thinking about how are we going to care for them while they are in counseling and or have completed counseling, so that counseling care, when they are received back in the church, is again rooted back into heart change and rooted back into the gospel of change, the gospel ministry of Jesus Christ. Fourth, at this level, there might be a point person who would be the contact for follow-ups with the professional or professionals that are providing counseling. This would mean that laws regarding confidentiality have to be followed, which means that those who are referred to counseling by the church ought to discuss with the parishioner about providing consent for release of information for the sake of continual care from the church. What I wanted to also highlight is that while creating this care team is important, again, I know I am emphasizing this, the team of people ought to have an understanding of their scope of expertise and limitations in regard to coming alongside folks with more acute counseling needs. And this humility is a crucial part of knowing how to bear one another's struggles. And again, as I share that with you, I'm not saying that the ministry of the gospel of Jesus is not powerful. What I'm saying again to you is that there are so many difficult struggles and acute issues that sometimes the church will miss out on and will not have the resources to be able to address. And so now, moving on to level 3, this is what I imagine for level 3. Level 3 is priority care and counseling. And this level involves emergency, urgent, and acute situations that cannot be and should not be placed on the back burner. I shared with you early on how oftentimes church leaders or pastors are the last to know about urgent issues and critical issues. So this level, again, is important in being able to understand how emergencies and urgent issues and acute situations cannot be put on the back burner, and it should be addressed in a timely manner. For example, urgent and acute situations might involve physical abuse between spouses or parent-child situations when there is a report of sexual abuse, or when someone is suicidal. So those are some really acute issues that I have found or experienced in the church. At this level, the counseling ministry or pastor, leader, or team must have a clear and organized protocol or plan that is aware of possible legal issues. Are the protocols clearly identified and understood? This might mean following mandated reporter laws. This might mean then that your church might start to implement training in mandated reporting laws. This might also mean knowing how to contact the proper authorities for aid. Does your church have a list of the proper authorities that you can contact? This might mean reaching out to appropriate professionals in a swift and timely manner. I had one time counseled a woman who was a victim of abuse in her marriage, and it was really critical. I had to know about the resources that were available to her. Again, in her church, there weren't many resources available to her. So I had to know about women's centers, what kind of legal supports that is available to her, especially as she also went through the process of getting a protection from abuse. And so these are kind of important pieces that the church ought to know about. And I'm not saying that the church should get involved in the weeds of all the legal kind of issues, but it'll be important for the church to understand that in these kinds of urgent and very acute situations, that a lot of the times it gets very, very messy and legal types of ramifications might happen. And so it'll be very important for churches to be able to have an eye on understanding the importance of this kind of level of care. There was a time last year during Hurricane Ida when there was during Hurricane Ida and our basement got really flooded. During that time, we had to put a claim in to State Farm regarding need for help from the insurance. And one of the interesting things was that, this is just an aside, but they delayed our claim because somehow my name was in their records regarding some kind of abuse. And what they had noted was that, and what they had shared to my husband and I, was that there could have been a possible abuse in our marriage. And did that happen? Because my name, again, was registered in the county court. And what we had recognized or understood was that the reason why that was in was because I was involved in a court kind of issue with this woman and was walking alongside her. So again, in this level, just wanted to highlight how important it is for the church to be able to understand these kinds of legal ramifications and perhaps even be able to be connected to different resources outside the church. In level 3, like in level 2, you might be developing a team of people coordinated by a church leader or pastor to build an appropriate care plan for folks, again, to walk alongside them. And then finally, it might be necessary to consider church discipline for appropriate issues. I know that that is something that in churches, it can be a really sticky issue or a difficult kind of an issue. Does your church have a real kind of organized understanding or a protocol to be able to consider church discipline for these kinds of appropriate issues? Now, as I just kind of conclude this with you all, I'm coming to you to, number one, share how important the care and counseling ministry is for the local church. That it shouldn't be an adjunct. As you can see, there are a lot of issues that the Asian American and people face. I'm also saying that as you start to build up your care and counseling ministry, that it might be important to really think about some of the gaps and how the church can start to fill in those gaps. I'm also saying that if not understood and if you don't implement the counseling ministry within a systemic perspective, that oftentimes you may start to miss out on or not be able to follow up on or not be able to really walk alongside folks who are really deeply struggling. What I'm also reminded of as I just conclude this is that I just remembered the panel who were sharing about abuse in the church. And one of the questions we're talking about, how do you, in some sense, start to address or start to think about preventing abuse in the church. And one thing I'm saying is that as I share with you about this systemic kind of perspective of care and counseling in the church, I think that this type of real multi-level perspective will be helpful to understand how these kinds of levels will offer a lot of different avenues for feedback, to be able to start to consider how important it is to address these kinds of abusive situations and not to have those fall to the wayside. And so to conclude, I know that there were a lot of visions or imaginations that I shared with you in terms of thinking about a multi-level understanding of care and counseling in the local church. I'm reminded again of the passage in Galatians chapter 6:2. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Christ, who was the ultimate burden bearer, now calls his church, the Asian American church, to bear each other's burdens through the counseling ministry. Let's pray. Father, I think that as we all sat with a lot of really important talks and sharings and panel discussions, it has become possibly really clear to all of us in here as leaders and pastors of our churches that care and counseling in the local church really does matter. Not only because of all the statistics, but because it is your call to bear one another's burdens, because you were the supreme burden bearer. And we do pray that we would think about this in a systemic perspective, not one-off or in small moments here and there, but in being able to consider how to really build up a richer, fuller counseling ministry in our church. Would you cause us, all of us, to really have softened hearts and wise minds to consider how this might look like on the ground in all our various churches with the various giftings and levels of resources that are available. And so in the midst of that, Lord, would you be with us? Would you continue to grow us and continue to prepare us as the bride of Christ as we await your return? In Jesus' name we pray.